not reading from it, we'll see the Gemara is going to explain. The Mishnah says you can't, there's a concern. If you read from it, you might come to tilt it, right? And what happens if you tilt it, you'll be violating the Shabbat. But what might happen? The fire might be getting dim. Let's say some of the oil is not as close to the wick as it needs to be. So there's a concern you might forget while you're engrossed in reading from it, and you might come to move the lamp, move the oil lantern. So the Mishnah said the rabbis came to protect the Torah, and the rabbi says, don't read la'or haneh. On Shabbat, don't read from the light of that lantern, because of that concern. One of the 39 malachot of Shabbat is not allowed to make a fire. So 12b2, we are on 12b2 of the first column. V'lo yikra la'or haneh. So Mr. Haber, is it clear? You cannot read by an oil lantern. If that is your light, right? Today, I would think the fact that we have the electric lights on, right? And so generally, even if a person is using Shabbat candles, they're using oil, right? If people would be using oil for Shabbat, a lot of people use, what do they do in your community? They use candles or oil or both? Candles. So candles definitely less. There's a question about candles. With the same halacha applied to candles, because candles is definitely much less of an issue of, mourning, that you'll be less concerned about moving. What are you going to be? How much what are you going to be moving? And you could say, are we afraid that you can move the candle towards you? And then, how much are we afraid by the candle? So the candles is definitely, I see in the Yalkut Yosef, there's a whole discussion about candles. Would candles also be a problem or not be a problem? And the Yitzchak Yosef writes that his father at the end was more lenient when it comes to candles. So let's take a look at the Gemara. Adam, we are on 12b. Good morning. We're on 12b2. If you want to send to the group, okay. Lo yikra. Let's see the Gemara. Lo yikra la'or haneh. The Mishnah stated you cannot go ahead and read on Shabbat to the light of to the light on Shabbat, and we're talking about the light of a lantern, right? That's what we're talking about. The oil, that was the typical light that they had. Of course, they also there was candles, but that was the typical light that we're talking about. Amar Rabba says, Afilu gavoa. By the way, but like I said, there is discussion halacha. Would this apply to candles as well? So some people are more strict, some people are less strict. Some people will put a paper saying Shabbat to remind them, not near the candle, in case they plan on using it on Shabbat to read from. They might put some paper there as a reminder, Shabbat. So now to serve, not you won't come to forget. So good morning, Asaf. So it says Lo yikra la'or haneh. Amar Rabba afila gavoa shtei komot. Even if this light is 2 floors high from the ground, that means it's double a person's height. That still, the rabbis did not make a distinction in this prohibition. If you're going to start reading, so some explain, because if you're going to read from it, Rashi says there's no problem. You're not going to be able, you have no way to access. If I have a candle that's 6 foot higher than I am, is there a way that I'm going to access that candle? Is there a concern that I'm going to go move the candle on Shabbat Aaron? Is there a concern? No. But nevertheless, where Rashi says, once the rabbi said you can't read from the light of that lantern, they didn't make a distinction exactly how close that lantern was to you. They didn't say, okay, only if it's within hand's reach. But if it's not within hand's reach, it's not a problem. And what's the reason for that? Why didn't they make a distinction between a hand's reach and if I can't reach it? Mr. Haber, one idea is because if you're going to go ahead and start making distinctions, people don't really get it sometimes. They see you're reading, you have a candle above you, 6 feet above you, you're reading from that, so they'll come to read from a candle that's next to you, right? So sometimes if you're going to start saying, this scenario you could do this, but that scenario you can't do that, people don't get it, and then they might come to actually read from it when it's right next to you. Adam, you hear the idea? So therefore, that could be an explanation of why the rabbis did not make a distinction in their fence. And they said the fence of not reading from a candle, from the light of a lantern would apply both if it's within hand's reach or both if it's not in hand's reach. And the Gemara says, "V'afilu shtei madot," even if it's the thing that they used for the animals to show the animals, how to go, which way to go, and it was even higher, even if each one was more than 6 feet. V'afilu asara batam zu agabe zu. Even if it's like 10 floors high, 10 floors high, and I want to read, there's a candle, there's a light of a lantern, it's all the way up there. It's a 10-story ceiling, right? It's a 10 times 6 feet, 60-foot ceiling. I still can't read from, they didn't make any distinction. So that is now, the way they bring down, they bring down, there's two different explanations why it would be forbidden even if it's not in hand's reach. One explanation is what I said. That's how the Rebbeinu Prachya learns, that the rabbis are concerned if you allow one scenario, they might come to allow a different scenario. And others say they just, when they made their gezerah, when they made their decree, they didn't create decree. They didn't say distinctions in the decree. They just made the decree blanket. But I would say that you could say they're both the same reason, the same thing. Why did the rabbis not make a distinction? But they're afraid that they're going to come to make mistakes. Okay. So now the Gemara said, the Mishnah says the word lo yikra. You can't read. Read is singular. It doesn't say they can't read to the light of a lantern. See, if is there a distinction? The Gemara is pointing out there seems to be a distinction between one person reading by the light or two people reading by the light. What now? Because what is the bigger novelty? That one person can't read by the light of a lantern or two people can't? It would be more novel to say two people can't. Why? Because when you have two people, the other guy maybe can remind you. If I see you going towards the lamp, I might say, "Hey, Aaron, Aaron, Shabbat. Oh, thank you, Rabbi." Or you'll say that to me. But if I'm doing it by myself, good morning, Ralph, good morning, Asaf. But if I'm doing it by myself, if I'm reading by myself, there's no one to remind me. So the mission, if it's true that two people can't read, if we're both together, we can't share to get, or we can't read at this lamp. So the Mishnah should have stated, and they can, and in the plural, they can't read by the multiple people can't read together. The fact that the Mishnah only said he can't read together, can't read at the light, indicates that there's a distinction between he and many. If it's true that more than one person could read by it, two people could read by it, so the Mishnah should have said, and they can, if it's true that two can't, but the Mishnah should have said the bigger chidush, the bigger novelty, and they can't read by the candlelight, by the light of the lantern. If it doesn't say they, it indicates that they would be permitted. Adam, is that clear, the point? Aaron, is that clear? That's what the Gemara says. Chanu de lo likri. One person can't read. But Trey Shapidami. But two people could read because two people, Ralph, we are on 12b2. 12b2 on the right, top right column.
I
But
got to get my glasses.
two people could read. So the Gemara has a question. What do you mean? Vatanya, we learned in the Braita, lo echad lo shnaim. We have in a Braita that says not only one person can't read by it, even two people can't read by it. So we have seems to be a argument between the Mishnah and the Braita. Because the Mishnah states one person can't read by the light. Inference is two people could. And the Braita says not one and not two can't read by the light. So how do we explain the apparent difficulty? Everything clear or not? Amar Rabbi Elazar lo kasha. As Mr. Haber says, case is different. If the case is different, what do you say, Mr. Haber? The law is different, might be. Not always is the case different, law different. You say a bori pre-8 on an apple, you say a bori pre-8 on an orange. The case is different. Today you're eating an orange, it's the same law. Not all the time if the case is different makes the law different, but many times it makes a difference. And that's what the story is over here. The Mish is talking about B'inyan Echad. Two people, you're reading together. We're reading the same thing. We're looking in together. We're joining together to learn a Gemara together at the light. So if we're working together, we're directly involved. I'm next to you. We're looking at the same page, so to speak. So everybody, I'll realize if you're moving your hand to go toward the lantern, because we're learning the same thing. We're looking at the same page. But if I'm looking in here, if I'm looking at this page, I'm reading here, and you're reading your own thing. So that I'm not necessarily noticing what you're doing. So therefore, that would be the problem. So when two people are reading together the same thing, so therefore that's not a problem, because I'm going to recognize we're reading the same thing. Let's say we're both reading the same parasha, right? Morning. I've opened up a Gemara and we're sharing a Gemara. So if I'm sharing a Gemara, we're both looking at the same page, but then I'll notice you, you'll notice me. But if we're each doing our own thing, one assignment, then maybe we won't notice each other. So that's what the Gemara says. Now, and some explain that means if they're both reading from the same book. If we're both sharing the same Sefer, the same holy, I don't want to call it a book, Sefer, holy book, then I'll notice you. But when each person has their own book, say holy Sefer in the hand, there's a concern that one will not realize what the other guy is doing. That's how the Ritva, that's how the Ritva, the Chedushi Haran, that's one of the ways to explain this Gemara. Okay, I think we'll explain it that way. But if each one has their own Sefer, you see, the other possibility is, what about if we're both looking at a Sefer, right? We have one Sefer open, and I'm looking at this side, and you're looking at that side. So you could also say if I'm let's say a scroll, let's say they used to have let's say Bereshit. They used to have separate scrolls, I think, for Bereshit, Shemot, not a whole Sefer Torah, right? So if we're using, it could be if I'm reading this side, let's say I'm looking at this side of the page, and you're looking at this, even though it could be one book, you could understand that the fact that it's one book doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to be on top of what you're doing, but we're looking at separate things. So some could explain, even if it's one Sefer, if you're looking at two different subjects, we're not looking at the same page, you could explain that could also be a problem. It's only if we're both looking, here, and I'm looking here, and then it's not a problem because we're both keying it. We're both seeing each other much more clearer. That's how some explain as well. Now, okay, let's continue in the Gemara. Amar Rav Huna, uva medura. What about if it's a medura? A medura is not it's not the light of a wick, one wick. Medura is many wicks, like a torch, many wicks that come together, like a bonfire, or right. That type of situation. If it's a medura, afilu asara b'nei adam asu. Even if it's 10 people, there's 10 people reading, they can't go ahead and it'll be forbidden. Even if they're all, what's their reason? Because they are sitting at a little distance from each other, and there's a concern because they don't get too close to the fire, and therefore there's a concern if it's a bonfire, they might come. Uh, I'm not gonna notice you what you're doing because we are away, we are distance from each other. Rashi says when it's a big, like Simon said, like a big fire, since they are far from each other, and also Rashi says another point that the sticks protruding from the bonfire are close to each person. Um, Therefore, you are again. But the bottom line is when it's a fire, you're more you're further away from each other, and since you're further away from each other, you're not gonna notice the other guy so much when he's going towards the when we're two people. If I'm sitting right next to you in a close proximity, so then we could say we can notice. I can notice what you're doing, and therefore I'll remind you if I see you're going to go ahead and move you're going to move towards that thing. But if you're far away from each other, further away from each other, then I'm not going to notice you as much. So therefore, there would be a problem if it's a larger fire. Okay, Amar Rava. So Rava, if you want to look at note number 17, you want to look at it says a bonfire covers a large area, and even 10 people sitting around it will be somewhat distant from each other, right? And therefore, since you'll be distant from each other, so therefore you won't notice the other guy. Furthermore, 6 they are close to each person.
It's like they're doing it by themselves.
Whereas a lamp
when
is
they're
usually
far apart.
farther away.
Yeah.
Thus, one reaching to stir a stick to make it burn brighter will not be noticed by another. So you won't notice the other guy when the guy is reaching to stir a stick, and therefore there's a concern. Okay, comes the Gemara, and the Gemara says, Amarava, im adam chashafu. Let's be going back to the case of the light of the lantern. The light of a lantern, a distinguished person does not move the light of a lantern. It's not so respectful for him, the president, or you don't need to be the president. Just a distinguished person. That's not the style that even during the weekdays, you don't move the lamp, even if the light becomes dimmer. That's not what he does. So because that's not what he does, that person is mutter. He's allowed to read. Morning, Emmanuel. That person is allowed to read from the light of a lantern, because what's the concern? So here now it's interesting. Now we're making a distinction between people. If a person if a person is not common that he would move a lantern during the weekdays, meaning once you put a lantern on, they don't move it, they don't touch it. The same way we said that children will not touch a lantern. They wouldn't move the lantern if the light gets dimmer because of awe of their rabbi or their teacher. They don't touch things without permission. Therefore, you don't have to worry that the children are going to move it on Shabbat. So too, a adult who's a very respectable person who generally doesn't move it, you don't have to worry. He's allowed to go ahead and read from it on Shabbat. Now, so the Gemara says, Meitive. You see, they point out, you know, we said before when it came to the lamp, we said it doesn't make a difference. You can't read whether it's in hand's reach or whether it's 10 floors high. You can't read, an individual can't read. We don't make a distinction between how close it's to you when it comes to that situation. And yet, when it comes to the individual, we make a distinction who you are, right? If you're the average person, you can't use it. And if you're a distinguished person, we say we can use it. So the commentaries discuss why is it that they separated by people, they made a distinction in their prohibition. They said it depends what type of person you are. And when it comes to the height, they didn't make a distinction. They said doesn't make a difference how high it is, right? That was now. So that's one of the things that they point out. You know, why did the rabbis feel you could make a distinction by the people, and they did not make a distinction by when it came to the height? Yes, what do you want to say?
What donates distinguished person? That's what I'm curious. What's the difference between a regular guy and a distinguished person?
You are a distinguished person, Ralph. What can I tell you? You're the man. That if you want to know a distinguished person, you look at yourself in the mirror, and that is a distinguished person. No, I think, Ralph, you know, I presume there's certain people like, you know, there were people back, you know, like there's something called a walking stick, right? There were certain people that walked with a walking stick, not because they needed help walking. It wasn't a cane. So walking stick, it's a distinguished, Moshe, Mateh Biyado. Certain people have, you know, are considered more distinguished by sometimes the class of, you know, he's a political leader, a rabbinic leader, uh, philanthropist. You know, there's certain things that, you know, that people have, you know, certain type of respect that's called an Adam Chashuv, and that would be, I would think, but it's a good point. The person has to know there are certain things that people understand that's an Adam Chashuv. You know, that is a person of distinction. Oh, it could be maybe it might be like below them for them to do it. I mean, let's say it might be below. If certain people, if they drop a penny, might not pick up the penny. So I think maybe it's not. They don't. It's not. It looks. I presume it looks like a menial or a low type of thing to move the lantern.
Would just have self-control not to, but I see what you mean.
Right. This is right because we're saying that even during the weekdays he won't do it. The point is, this guy, because of his class of respect that he's in, it's too. Okay, let's someone else, or it's like a little lower type of activity. You know, am I going to clean the toilet? You know, what I'm saying not that it's connected. It's a different thing, but that's how it was looked. Now remember, there were certain lamps that would give off a bad odor, possibly. Also, not all lamps are so pretty. Certain of them made out of earthenware. Maybe just the whole thing of moving a lantern on Shabbat. Maybe with a Tiffany. Maybe good point. So now here we have you got Ralph to give a nice smile and laugh on that, Simon. So we're talking about the rabbi's prohibition of reading on Shabbat at a light of a lantern. Everything, the electricity is off, there's no electricity on, and you have a nice lantern, and there's a concern, the rabbis are concerned that you might come to, if the light gets dim of the lantern, you might move the lantern to get the oil closer to the wick, which would be a violation of Shabbat, of making a fire. Increasing the fire is like making a fire. So now here's a fascinating Gemara, very famous Gemara coming up, everybody. Meitive. I'll ask you the following question. Lo yikre la'or haner. It says you cannot read to the light of a lantern. Shema yate. Maybe you're going to go ahead and move the lantern, right? So it's interesting. Our Mishnah did not go on record and say the reason. The Mishnah just says, don't read by the light of the lantern. The Braita says, you know what? And the Braita says, because maybe you're going to move it. Pamachat, Amar Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. So Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha says, Ani ekra v'lo ateh. I'm going to go ahead and read, and I'm going to be careful. So what was he saying? He was saying that he should be allowed, because if you're saying the whole prohibition is that you might come to move the snare, so he says, I'm confident that I'm not going to move the snare. That seems to be the way, because he understood, you're telling me this prohibition is specifically because you might come to move it. I know myself. I know Shabbat. I am very careful about Shabbat. That's how we could read it. And I'm not going to come to move the nair on Shabbat. So
Read the last line.
the Pamachat, but you know what happened? One time, Kara. He read by the lantern, Ubikesh Lahatot, and he was thinking of moving the lantern. Meaning, you know what it sounds like? Many times he read, there was no problem. But there was one time, after a certain amount of time, that he read, and Pamachat, one time that he almost violated the laws of Shabbat, but he remembered. So when that happened, he says, how great are the words of the rabbis, that the rabbi said, don't read to the Or Haneh. Don't read at the light of a lantern. So the obvious question is, if he knew the rabbi says don't read at the light of the lantern. So now, but he says it's not going to apply to me. How could he could you just say it doesn't, if the rabbi said don't do it, so what is he understanding? What is his change? What is he saying? How great are the words of the rabbi? So is he just saying, you know what? The rabbis know better than I know myself? Is that what he's saying? How great are the words of the rabbi? The rabbi said don't do it. I said that it's not going to apply to me. Because I'm not going to, a lot of people say, it won't happen to me. I won't do it. But the rabbis know better. But if that's the case, so how is he able? Well, he knows. How can you go against if the rabbis made an enactment? You can't just say it's not going to apply to me. You can't say you know better than the rabbi. So I think I once heard the following idea. The following: if you notice, the Mishnah did not state don't read. The Mishnah did not say the reason. The Mishnah says don't read to the light of a lantern. Period. So that seems to indicate it has nothing. Doesn't make a difference whether you're going to move it, whether you're not going to move it, whether you know yourself, you don't know yourself. Don't do it. The Breita that we had in the Gemara when Rabbi Yishmael said, the Breita that stated, don't read to the light of a lantern because maybe you're going to move it. So Rabbi Yishmael perhaps understood that this the prohibition is only if maybe you're going to move it, and he understood that if you're an individual that is not going to move it, there's no prohibition. Now, generally, a person can't say, I'm different. It doesn't apply to me. But the fact that the prohibition was stated with the reason, that meaning it's not that you can't do it, and then the reason is secondary to the prohibition. The prohibition and the reason are tied together as for it to be prohibited. He thought that this prohibition is specifically, it's prohibited because you're going you might do it, and if you were a person that will not move it, the prohibition doesn't apply to you. So maybe that's what he was thinking. And then he says, how great are the words of the rabbis that we found the Mishnah that the other rabbis said did not give the reason, did not connect the reason of the law to the actual prohibition. And that's how you have to look at things when it comes to law. Don't always, now sometimes the law is dependent on the reason, and sometimes even if the reason doesn't apply, the law still applies. So maybe that's what he's saying. How great are the words of the rabbis of Al Mishnah that did not connect the reason to and sometimes that's where some people go wrong. Shlomo HaMelech made a mistake. What was his mistake? The Torah says, don't have many wives. The king is not allowed to have many wives, because maybe they will turn his heart. They'll have a negative effect. So what did Shlomo HaMelech say? I know myself. I can have many wives and they won't affect me. So he married many wives. And they had some sort of a negative effect on his level. We make a Misha Berach. What do we say, Simon? Misha Berach, Av Mitzvah Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, David, Shlomo. So remember, Shlomo remained a great tzaddik with all the wives. We still evoke his name now every day. But on his level, they had a negative impact. But because the reason was given next to the prohibition, don't do this because of that. So he understood that as long as that the reason doesn't apply to me, the prohibition doesn't apply. And you hear what I'm saying? Sometimes, if you just say don't do it, and you don't connect it to the reason, so you don't say that, you don't make distinctions between your personal situation and the prohibition. So Shlomo HaMelech, is it clear? Shlomo HaMelech said, the Torah says, don't marry many wives, and Torah gave a reason. Torah would have just said, don't marry many wives. He would have married many wives. Torah says, don't marry many wives. You can't violate the Torah. Torah says, don't marry many wives because they're going to turn your heart. So you know what Shlomo HaMelech said? They're not going to turn my heart. So it doesn't apply to me. So Yishmael ben Elijah said the same thing. The prohibition is, don't read by a lantern because maybe you're going to move it. That doesn't apply to me. And then he says, you know what? Great are the words of the rabbi. It's great when the reasons aren't given. When our mission did not give the reason, don't connect always the prohibition to the reason, because if you always do that, then sometimes you're going to think it doesn't apply to you, but really it does apply to you. Period. Don't do it, period. Exactly what was said. Unless the law actually states that, you know what, there is a distinction between certain people and other people. Like here we had the distinction between a respectable, very distinguished person. The prohibition was never given to that person. But if the law itself did not have the distinction, you as an individual cannot, Aaron, you hear what we're saying? You as an individual cannot say it doesn't apply to me. That you can't do. So that is the possible way to. He thought that the prohibition is only if you're a person that there's a concern that he's going to move it. Now, Rav Noten on that. Rav Natan says he actually says Korav hit. He had a he had an understanding that he actually violated the Shabbat unintentionally. That Rav Yishmael ben Elisha actually moved the lantern unintentionally. And he wrote, he wrote on his ledger, Ani Yishmael ben Elisha, I, Yishmael ben Elisha, Kariti, I read at the light of a lantern, V'teiti ner b'Shabbat. I moved the lantern on Shabbat, V'sheyibona Beit HaMikdash, when the Beit HaMikdash will be rebuilt, Avi Chatat Shemeina. I will bring a very healthy, fatty korban offering to atone for my violation of the Shabbat. I wonder, we see two different opinions as whether he actually did move the lantern or not. I wonder if it's possible that the opinion that says he didn't move the lantern, maybe he considered himself as if he moved it. So maybe even that perhaps he could say when the Beit HaMikdash will be rebuilt, I'm going to bring a sin offering. But maybe that opinion, if maybe that first opinion would hold, it's not because he wants to bring an offering because he actually moved it. Maybe because on his level that he felt so guilty for almost moving it that he felt as if he moved it, and he wanted to give himself a strictness that he would have to bring an offering as a sin offering to make up for doing this thing, even though he didn't actually do the actual sin. Maybe that's where you can have an opinion that says he actually said, I sinned. What is it? It could be he might have considered himself sinning when he didn't actually do the sin. See what I'm saying? Some people look at this, I almost did such a thing. They consider it as if I did it. Perhaps that could be weird. Why there is so the Gemara says now with this being now Tosos. First of all, what the Gemara says, Amar Abba. So the Gemara's question is, you told me a minute ago that a respectable person has a right to go ahead and read by the lamp of a lantern because they're not going to move it. And here it says, the Gemara says that Rabbi Yishmael says I was wrong. But how great are the words of the rabbis? I did something wrong, but why did I do anything wrong? You told me there was no prohibition for a respectful person, to read by such a thing, because he doesn't move it during the weekdays. You don't have to worry, he's going to move it on Shabbat, because he doesn't move the light of a lantern. So why is Rabbi Yishmael blaming him? I did something wrong. I should have, like the rabbi said, don't read by it. I made a mistake. What do you make a mistake? You had a right to read from it, but you were you're a distinguished person. So the Gemara says, Amar Abba, Shainer Bishol ben Elisha, Hoyul Mesim Atzma Divitor Kehedid. He's different. When he learned Torah, he made himself like a regular guy, one of the boys. He took off his jacket, he took off his tie, he made himself, he was sitting. What does that mean? Some people, when they learn, they like I said, you think they're one of the boys. They're not in that distinguished position at the big chair or whatever it was, place. Or that's how, when it came to learning Torah, he made himself like he didn't act like that distinguished position that you're in. I was once I was in Eretz Yisrael in a yeshiva, in a certain yeshiva, and one of the Rosh Yeshivas of YU was there, Rabbi Reisman. He published Rav Soloveitchik's Svarim. He was the one who wrote Rav Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik. And I come into the Beis Medrash, and he's sitting like everybody else. He's a man. He's like 75 years old, whatever it is. A distinguished Rosh Yeshiva. He could be sitting all the way in the front, but sitting all the way in the back. Get what I'm saying? So he was like one of the boys, so to speak. So if you're that type of person when it comes to Torah, so you're a person who would move it during the week. So you don't have that dispensation because you're a respectable person. You won't move it during the week. If you won't move Shabbat, he would move it during the week. So therefore, he doesn't have that allowance. But he felt, even though I would move it during the week, but on Shabbat I will not move it. Because it's Shabbat. I will never move a lamp on Shabbat. So the law, he thought that the law is also, there's also a distinction between a person who knows themselves and doesn't know themselves. And therefore, that's why he read by that lantern. And then he realized that was a mistake because the law does not distinguish of whether you know yourself or not. Okay, I want to wish everyone a great day, and we'll continue tomorrow. Tosfos is going to ask the question, doesn't God protect the tzaddik not to do such a sin? Not to sin. Tosfos says, God will protect the tzaddik not to eat something which is not kosher. Because that goes into your body, part of you. But God will not necessarily protect the tzaddik from making a mistake, something else outside of your inside that comes into your body. How do you like that chiddush of Tosfos? We'll see tomorrow more about that. Have a great day.